Yeah, thanks for coming. I will talk today about my work on phosphorus effects on the land carbon cycle and also on the management of land. I structured the talk into two parts. Thematically, the first part will be on the land carbon uptake, and the second part will be on the land management. And it's a continuation of past work and future perspectives of land work. So what's the carbon sink? So the whole thing started with this famous paper of Tanz et al., where they showed for the first time that climate models which assume that the land biosphere is carbon neutral were not able to capture the latitudinal gradient in atmospheric CO2 concentration here indicated by these points. And the models would be these broken lines. And you can see that there's a discrepancy. I remove this little panel there. In the northern hemisphere, where the models overpredict the CO2 concentration, and that kind of pointed towards a missing process which removes actively CO2 from the atmosphere. That's the whole start of the story. A few years later, different groups, all from Europe, here I highlight the work from the LSE people, IPTL people, showed using a climate model which it has taken into account a process called CO2 fertilization of vegetation, that they actually can predict carbon uptake of the northern hemisphere, indicated here by the globe and plot. That was very idealized, and they demonstrated this in the right order of magnitude to explain sink, needed to explain this kind of missing sink. At the same time, ecologists initiated field-scale experiments where they fumigated a part of the ecosystem with elevated CO2 to increase the CO2 concentration. And a part of these ecosystems, like within such rings, to concentrations we would expect to see in the future, so ambient CO2. And then they compare the plant growth within the rings and outside the rings, where the plants still see the ambient levels, to get the effect of the elevated CO2. And this is shown here on the panel on the right-hand side. You have on the x-axis the net primary activity, which is a measure of plant growth, carbon uptake, CO2 concentration, and on the y-axis for elevated CO2. And you can see that it's not lying on the one-to-one line, but the elevated CO2 plots show a higher productivity. And this led these people to conclude that the effect of CO2 fertilization is firmly established, at least it's in these systems where they conducted these experiments, which were in the temperate zone and young stands. So this could have been the end to the story. However, it was the beginning of a more interesting story, because when they prolonged one of these experiments for another 5 years, so the first papers were just looking at the first 5 years of an experiment. In which the experiment shown here showed that after 10 years, the stimulation of plant productivity was the same in the plus with elevated CO2 and the concentration. And there had kinds of some hints that it's related to nutrient availability. So this is kind of the beginning of the story of nutrient effects in the carbon sink. And that's also around the time when I started my PhD. So first, what are nutrients? Life on Earth consists only of a few of the elements present on the Earth, which are highlighted in green, and arguably one of the coolest one, the most badass one, is phosphorus. That's because phosphorus arrived on Earth on comets, so that could maybe explain why it's so scarce. It's essential to all life forms because it's an integral part of important things like ATP, which is for the energy system on a cellular level, DNA, RNA, which stores the information of life, and also it's part of the cell membrane. So all organisms and cells need phosphorus, and it has a very high reactivity and it's very toxic. It never occurs as a free element, why it's used as bombs, but it could also explain phenomena like ghosts or human spontaneous combustions. So, for example, people write books like The Shocking History of Phosphorus because it's actually quite interesting, but I cannot really cover all these things here because I want to talk about the phosphorus effects on the carbon cycle. So to link phosphorus with carbon, there's a concept of stoichiometric homeostasis, and this kind of says that organisms maintain a certain chemical composition irrespectively of the environment. So my chemical composition is the same as anyone here in the room, irrespectively of what we eat, where we grow up, what we do. And here you can see the chemical composition of a baby. You see it's mostly consisting of a couple of these elements. It's water, mostly water, and carbon, nitrogen, calcium, because we have bones, but also phosphorus. And this is called stoichiometric homeostasis, that organisms keep their chemical composition irrespective of their environment. That's also true for a log, and a log also has a chemical which is not too different from a baby or from a human. And in ecology, we like to simplify things even more, removing the water and just looking at the three most abundant elements, the most important elements. That's carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And by using carbon, nitrogen, to phosphorus ratio, we can indicate the relative abundance within of these important elements within a certain material. So you can see a log has quite a lot of carbon, like 4 kilograms carbon per 1 gram of phosphorus. While other things on Earth, like leaves, have less carbon, microbes even less carbon. However, the nitrogen to phosphorus ratio, roughly, it's rough numbers, it's roughly usually the same. And this is an important concept in ecology. And if you apply this concept of stoichiometric homeostasis and CMP ratios, you can derive from a carbon sink the amount of nitrogen or phosphorus needed to realize the carbon sink if it's in form of organic material. And this is what people, or what Bruce Hungate did in 2004, where there was no coupled carbon nitrogen modeling. He used projections of carbon models with respect to the future carbon sink on the y-axis, and he used information where it is stored, in wood, leaves, etc., and the respective carbon to nitrogen ratio to derive the nitrogen requirement for the sink. And he then compared it to an estimate of how much nitrogen is available in soils, and you can see many of these models predicted a carbon sink which is not in line with respect to its nitrogen requirement and the nitrogen availability in soils. A similar attempt was done by Josep Benuelas and Philip and others in 2013, where they did the same thing, but this time they used carbon phosphorus ratios. So again, we have here the projected carbon sink from carbon cycle models and the phosphorus demand on the y-axis on the left-hand side here, compared to the phosphorus supply in soils, and the picture is inconclusive because we have a very vague idea how much phosphorus is actually available on the time scales of the century for which the sink is valid for. So these approaches fail, and they fail because of a couple of key challenges. I labeled them here. On the one hand, soil phosphorus is very heterogeneously distributed among soils. Here, recent estimates I did with colleagues in China, and you can see that the total soil phosphorus stock is much lower in tropical regions than in the higher latitudes, and this is because these soils in the tropics are very old. And the older the soil, the more time has passed by which the soil would lose phosphorus. So the older the soil, the lesser the phosphorus concentration. And in these higher latitudes, we had the glaciation cycles, which make the soil smooth. So it's much higher there. That's why the general idea was a couple of years ago that phosphorus limitation is mostly restricted to the to the tropics, where the total soil phosphorus stocks are rather low. On the other hand, not only it's spatially variable, but it's also in time very variable, because we have different kinds of phosphorus forms in the soils. We have organic ones and inorganic ones, and there are different ones of each of these two classes, and they vary with respect to the bioavailability or the bioavailability. And only the phosphorus, which is the soil solution, is available for biologic uptake. So if you really want to know how much the total soil phosphorus is available, you have to have an idea what all these complex dynamics in the soil happening in the soil, leaving only less than 1% of total soil phosphorus available for direct biological. To make things even more complicated, the carbon sink, which is made by the vegetation, It's mediated by vegetation, and vegetation is not passively just taking what's in the soil, but they also can influence what's happening in the soil by excavating chemicals or carbohydrates to fuel the life of the soil organisms, which then can increase the phosphorus availability. And this is a feedback between vegetation and soil, and this also has to be considered if you want to know how much phosphorus is available on a time scales of decades to centuries. So these are the three key challenges, and these tools I showed before, where you use these concepts of homeostasis, fail, but we think because they cannot really cover these aspects, so what's better, well, it's more suited to tackle this challenge are process-based models. And why? That's because they resolve processes which govern these exchanges of phosphorus between the soils or between plants and soils. And also they resolve these processes on their intrinsic time scale. So you have microbial activity or microbial uptake, which happens on the time scale of minutes, but also you have changes in soil biogeochemistry, which takes 10 years and 100 years to evolve. And they're all interlinked within one consistent framework. So we can resolve the underlying process and don't have to make any assumptions about their overall behavior. And the other advantage is that the land surface or process-based model, here an example, the land surface model, they take advantage of the observational data we have, but also of the theoretical understanding we have. So we have the theory and the observations, and because these processes are resolved on the intrinsic timescales, which is very variable, we can use all kinds of information, various temporal and spatial scale, to parameterize these models or the processes. And then we can make predictions which are constrained by observations and by data. That's the key advantage. That's why process-based modeling is the key, it's a major tool I apply in my research, but it's not the only one, but it's the key one. And to give you an example about the most famous one of these process-based models, I would assume it's the land surface model, and the land surface model has evolved since the 1970s, and increasingly over time, shown here, they got more and more complex, accounting for more and more processes relevant for the climate system with respect to the land surface. They started with the energy fluxes, but now they include all kinds of things like human management, vegetation dynamics, etc. To give you just a brief idea about some key features related to my work, to the biogeochemistry, the first key paper, I think, is the paper of Phosphate, where he linked the carbon and water cycle on the leaf level. He linked the stomatal conductance, which gives the resistance of vegetation to water and to carbon, and thereby he linked the carbon and the water cycle on the leaf level. And a few years later, as I showed before, different groups in Europe included the whole carbon cycle, so the carbon and vegetation in soils in different compartments. Then even the pace gets faster, like 5 years later, the nitrogen cycle were introduced, and another 5 years, the first phosphorus cycle models emerged. And with respect to the inclusion of the phosphorus cycle in such types of models, I did a lot of work. I just highlight you on the first papers I did pioneering this kind of inclusion of the phosphorus cycle. Now I want to show you some of the results which can be derived from applying these models. First, the first study I did, or there was the first study which tried to quantify the phosphorus constraint on the land carbon sink using process-based modeling. And this is my PhD work. You can see predictions of a model I developed, which you have cycles of carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, and you can switch off the nitrogen and the phosphorus cycle individually. So you can make runs with just carbon cycle, with the carbon and nitrogen cycle, with the carbon and phosphorus, and all three cycles. And by comparing the predictions from these different kinds of model setups, you can easily isolate the effect of nitrogen or phosphorus. And what we found is that the effect here, total land carbon storage under idealized simulations for a long period of time, are much lower if you count for nitrogen or phosphorus, and if you count both, the effects are rather additive. So this was the first time where it was shown that phosphorus constraints can be substantial. It's still highly uncertain at this point of time. And also that the additive, that you cannot just include nitrogen and hope you get the overall nutrient effect, but they are additive, so you should cover nitrogen and phosphorus. Another key prediction of this paper is that for the first time, it predicted phosphorus limitation outside the tropics, so in regions where we have rather moderately to high phosphorus, phosphorus stocks. And this is because we pinned it down in latest studies, because the humans, they emit so much, they increase so much the carbon dioxide availability of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. There is a strong imbalance between the carbon and the nitrogen phosphorus availability, which is also the project imbalance feed that was leading. So it predicted extratropical phosphorus limitation, which was kind of new at that point of time. And 10 years later, there's 2 lines of evidence which really shows in ecosystem manipulation experiments where people add phosphorus fertilizer to an ecosystem and look if they respond or not to plants. And they show it indeed is the case, and also a different independent estimate of phosphorus limitation, both times here red, using plant nutrient economy considerations. As I'm applying process-based models, I can also look at the respective process and how this respective process links with phosphorus, and I focus now on these carbon processes which are related to the land carbon sink. The land carbon cycle can be very idealized, very simplistic, be illustrated by this figure from Walker et al., where you can see that the atmospheric CO2 is taken up by plants in the leaves, and then in the process of photosynthesis is fixed to produce carbohydrates with the use of light energy, which part of these carbohydrates is respired back to the atmosphere by plants to fuel their activity. So plants have to eat like we have to eat. And the remaining is used to build up biomass like grow leaves, grow wood. And from this then increases the vegetation carbon stock, and vegetation also dies, is turning over because of mortality of pests, etc. And there's a decay rate, and then it enters the soil or the dead organic matter pool, which then again is decomposed by microbes releasing back CO2 to the atmosphere. It's very simplified here. Many processes are omitted, but I just want to show it here where we expect phosphorus controls could happen, and you can see all these processes are theoretically constrained by phosphorus. And in my work today, or it's also generalizable to the wider community. Most work has been done on this uptake part of the cycle, where people could really demonstrate that they're phosphorus constrained in this process, less so on the loss pathways. To give you some specific examples, here an example of most recent work led by David Ellsworth. It is a continuation of work started by Jens Katke, where Jens for the first time showed that the photosynthetic capacity of plants relates directly to the leaf nitrogen concentration. And then other studies were speculating that phosphorus might play a role too, and I think the study by Ellsworth for the first time robustly showed that the relationship between photosynthetic capacity and leaf nitrogen on the x-axis is different for species if they have low or high phosphorus concentration in the leaf. And we derived an empirical relationship relating the photosynthetic parameters of the fibre model to leaf nitrogen and phosphorus concentration and plugged it into Orchidase CMP to simulate the tropical productivity, the gross primary productivity of the pan-tropical zone. And we did 2 kinds of simulation just to give a first order estimate of what's the maximum effect of that. That's the maximum effect of the suboptimal availability of phosphorus in the tropical zone. And we did a simulation where we assumed that all plants in the tropics, they can put the maximum amount of phosphorus in their leaves as possible, and one with realistic leaf phosphorus concentration. You can see that the gross primary productivity is about a factor of 2 larger in the simulation where the plants really pack the leaves with phosphorus. The question is if this makes any sense for plants at all to reach such high level, but it just shows that the phosphorus constraints on the CO2 fixation of ecosystems in the tropic is substantial. So we also did work on a new generation of free air carbon enrichment experiments. That's the experiments where they fumigate a part of the ecosystem with CO2 to look at the difference between the ambient plots and elevated CO2 plots within the rings. And this is a famous experiment done in Sydney on a mature eucalyptus stand on very impoverished, phosphorus impoverished soils. And they found that there was no effect after 5 years of CO2 fumigation between no effect on GDP of CO2 fumigation. This is also true for net primary productivity. I'm not showing here. And we're doing a modeling exercise where we could show that it could be related to phosphorus. However, we're not yet sure it's really the mature state of the ecosystem which limits the CO2 response or the phosphorus constraint. So that's why they start now a phosphorus fertilization experiment there. However, we did a similar exercise for a free air carbon enrichment experiment in Brazil. It's just starting because there are problems in funding them, the CO2 to fumigate such huge trees. But what we did here is, in the meanwhile, we used carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus models, a bunch of them, and we did predictions with all of these models, what the models would predict, how the experiments should look like in reality. And we found that carbon-only models predict usually a higher response of GPP or NPP than, for example, a phosphorus model, and this was generalizable among a bunch of them, of these type of models, giving some further confidence that phosphorus is limiting on top of nitrogen, because we use several models and thereby can have some kind of uncertainty because each model describes this uncertain process in a bit different way. On a global scale, there's also some indirect hints that the phosphorus limitation might lead to a decline in the stimulation of global photosynthesis due to the increase in CO2 concentration. And this is work where they use proxies for photosynthesis from satellites, and they look at the beta factor, which is the percentage increase in GDP for 100% for 100 ppm increase in CO2, the running mean. And they found that this beta factor is declining over time. And on the other hand, the unexplained part of this trend, which was not related to climate or CO2, they could link with, it was larger in areas where the leaf phosphorus concentration was lower. So where the leaf phosphorus concentration was lower, these areas showed a larger decline in its beta factor, which is a loose hint that it might be related to phosphorus. Which is kind of concerning because then it would mean the carbon sink will decline over time. Which it actually does in some tropical region. We already see that the net carbon sink is declining. For example, here on the brownish line for the Amazon basin, but other ecosystems, tropical ecosystems like the African biome, shows rather stable and or increasing carbon sinks. So if my work shows that we overestimate the positive effect of CO2 on the carbon sink, what else could drive sink? This is something I have been looking into detail more recently, so that's ongoing in future work. So I'm investigating alternative drivers of the carbon sink. And one of them could be related to deposition. And as I said, in Africa, we have stable carbon sinks. And Africa is also a continent where we have ecosystems, the savannas, which are burned very frequently. So here on the right-hand side, you can see a map for the year 2016, the burned area, and red pixels, they are burned every year. So they're burned frequently, and the prevailing winds happen to be that when there's a savanna fire, they blow the dust, which contains also nutrients in the particles emitted from the burning of biomass, to blow them on the moist tropical forests in Central Africa, which grow in the most impoverished soils, among the most phosphorus impoverished soils in the world. And thereby can they could fertilize this in the tropics. And that's also the same is true when the northern, the southern part of Africa winds. So that's a rather qualitative theory put forward by Wouters in reference to the instance of old idea actually. So we used reconstructions of phosphorus deposition, which was done by Ron Wang. He was a PhD of Eve and Philippe. We did reconstructions of phosphorus deposition from the 1960s to present day, decadal predictions. accounting for the changes in biomass burning, in phosphorus emission also from other sources like seafloor or dust. And we found that the phosphorus deposition over Central Africa is actually increasing quite a lot and quite drastically from the 90s to the 2000s. So I used these reconstructions of phosphorus deposition to drive the orchidea land surface model for a site in Congo, where we have a lot of data collected among starting a conference tower. We constrained the model; it performs rather well for the site, and we then looked at the evolution of the vegetation carbon sink in simulations where we accounted for the increase in CO2 concentration, the increase in phosphorus deposition, climate change, and another simulation where we did not account for the increase in phosphorus deposition. And I found that for this site, at least Montigay, the sink is a factor of 2 larger. So this kind of gives a hint that phosphorus deposition or changes therein could be an important driver for at least sites in these regions with respect to the carbon sink. But currently, they are not accounted for any of these reconstructions of the past or future carbon sinks. To summarize the first part of the presentation on the land carbon sink, I think the importance of the phosphorus on the land carbon sink has been demonstrated, not only by modeling, but also by other methodologies. As I said earlier, the phosphorus controls on the loss pathways remain understudied, so we know not too much about there yet. So that's one of the perspectives I have for the future. And still, the major uncertainty related to the land carbon sink, but also to the management of land, is that we have a very poor capability to predict how much of the soil phosphorus is available over a time scale of years to centuries. So the latter 2 points are kind of my perspective for the future. And here I just want to put you some numbers to really indicate what kind of numbers we're talking. So the total soil phosphorus stocks is around 60,000 teragrams, but only less than 4 teragrams is needed to sustain a sink. This is because only a very tiny fraction is available for plants, but still we see their plants are limited by phosphorus availability. So we really need to have kind of a good, fine model, fine predictive capabilities to really get these kind of phosphorus limitations on the vegetation. And to do so, I'm building since a couple of years. It started already during my postdoc in Hamburg, to build data-driven models for the soil. This includes organic and inorganic matter, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus. And we stepwise build models which have some kind of philosophies behind them. One is to have measurable pools. The first one was like using the YASO model. We try to use as much available data as possible. We use data from the laboratory, from continental scale, or from global upscaling, using machine learning as a link to bridge the scales. And we also couple it increasingly with the atmosphere, also with aquatic systems, for example, erosion, which is an important phosphorus loss process, is usually accounted for in global and phosphorus models. So we use a lot of data. We try and measure a pool to make the link between the available data easy. We try to make use of new paradigms like the microbes matter. And we also use new approaches where we combine data-driven modeling like machine learning and physics-based models like process-based modeling to in particular to increase the interface between observations and rather coarse scale models. So this is the perspective for the future for the first part. Now come to the second part of the talk, which will be on phosphorus effect in land management, which is something I have more recently started to look at as I was joining the Sealand Convergence Institute of Benoit and Philippe. So this is more recent work and more perspective work in this part. So I want to start with just highlighting the key challenges with respect to phosphorus in land management. On the one hand, phosphorus is critical for food production. You know, phosphorus is a fertilizer which is supplied widely, not only for food, but also for fibre production. We have some paper on that too. But here you can see a map from McDonald where they show a map where they show areas in red where farmers apply more phosphorus than they actually need to sustain crop productivity, and in blue areas where they don't supply enough phosphorus to realize the full crop production potential given by the climatic conditions there. And as you might know now, Russia, Ukraine are important food production countries, but still the don't apply as much phosphorus as they could to really maximize their yield apart from doing war. So it's critical for food and fiber production, but it's very unevenly distributed or used. And this is because phosphorus is a very expensive resource, and also you can see the phosphorus price over time. And you can see it's very prone to spikes, which are related to speculations, I guess, which just amplify crises like COVID or now the Ukraine war, which put the prices on a record level, which then prevents poor countries or farmers which have no good stability in their political, socio-political environment to buy phosphorus and apply it in their fields. Phosphorus is expensive because it's scarce, and it's not only scarce, it's also controlled by a few countries, like mostly from Morocco. It's their own territories in West Sahara they occupy, where they control most of the available phosphorus reserves, which can be used to produce mineral phosphorus fertilizer, and a few other countries also have some reserves. And the total amounts, given the actual, the current mining rates, we expect that the reserves are exploited within the next couple of hundred years. I know a famous paper from 2009, which you might have seen, where they used rather wrong estimates of how much phosphorus is available. They underestimated it. They came up that we already will peak with phosphorus production 10 years. And the numbers are wrong, so this is a robust estimate. So phosphate rock is expensive, its access is very limited. On the other hand, other countries which have access to it or can afford it, they overuse it. And if you overuse phosphorus in agricultural production or in other parts of the economic sector, like the 10 seeds and the washing powder in the 80s, when the phosphorus then goes into aquatic systems, it can trigger algae blooms. As I said, phosphorus is very scarce. So if you put phosphorus in the systems, the bacteria grow, they just explode in their population size and they produce toxins or oxygen deprived zones, and thereby the higher life dies. We had also a study led by Yuan Huang, which showed that fishery also is changing a lot the global phosphorus cycle. Or recent work by Christine Alevel, who showed that the rate at which we lose soils because of erosion, etc., we lose a lot of phosphorus, which then is lost to aquatic system. It's very expensive and hard to get back. And we're doing that at a rate which is threatening the habitability of the planet, or whole planet, according to this Rockström's concept of planetary boundary. Phosphorus is one of the bad ones. So there's key challenges which need to be addressed to really cover all these different aspects. They are also realized by societies and policies, for example, by the UN or by the EU. So on the one hand, we have multiple land uses which compete for a limited land area. We need land to produce more food. We need land to conserve biodiversity, to fight climate change by afforestation, etc. So that's the idea of the Sea Land Institute. We need to reduce fertilizer usage in areas where it's applied too much, but we also need to increase the availability in countries where it's too little, in particular to raise the wealth of the farmers there. And we need to restore, preserve, and protect our soils because most of our food comes from soil. So if we lose them, we will not be able to use them anymore to cook food. And one solution which could address all these different challenges are soil amendments, in particular ones which have a multi-purpose. And my favorite one is rock dust. So that's something which is most promising. It's still uncertain, but it's a new line of research. It has different features, so it can remove CO2 actively from the atmosphere. It can improve soil fertility. It can be co-deployed, so you can put it on the agricultural field, you can put it in your garden, in your afforestation project, where you want to put it. And it's relatively cheaply and widely available because the rocks we can use for that, they're everywhere. And you can even use some material considered as mining waste or construction waste. So actually some things are currently considered waste, but they have to be grinded and they can be. So it addresses all the different challenges. And to give you just a quick idea, what's the CO2 removal concept? It's the idea of enhancing the slow geological carbon cycle, which is illustrated by the CO2 reaction of minerals as rocks, as they chemically weather. the silicates in these minerals direct with CO2, and the CO2 is bound in carbonates. They're transported by the rivers to the ocean. They're going to the ocean floor, and only when they come up, we are on tectonic timescales like uplift and outgas and volcanoes, they go back to the atmosphere. And this process here, where the CO2 from the atmosphere is bound to minerals, this process is limited by the reactive surface area of these minerals. So you take rocks and make them very fine, you increase the surface areas by orders of magnitudes, and thereby you can increase the flux by orders of magnitude, while the other ones stay the same, so you make a sink. The second process is the purpose is to improve soil fertility, and there's two aspects. On the one hand, you can increase the availability of the nutrients which already, some part of the nutrients which are already in the soil by just changing with the soil pH. That's a liming effect that's known for centuries, and it's applied since decades in commercial farming. And the second aspect is that some rocks, if you choose the right kind of rock, it also contains phosphorus, potassium, and other minerals, nutrients. So you can enhance the availability of what's already in the soil, and you can add additional nutrients. This is shown by a couple of papers here. And because of these two purposes, the past research has usually focused on the application in agriculture, because you can use it as a phosphorus fertilizer substitute, mineral fertilizer substitute, which has recently been shown by this paper of Reconstruction for the UK, taking all kinds of constraints into consideration of the UK economy and agricultural sector. And they thought that you can achieve phosphorus release rates from rock dust, which are comparable to what is required by the crops in the UK. So it can be used as phosphorus, as a mineral fertilizer substitute. And in the meanwhile, you get additional money because you remove CO2 from the atmosphere. You can credit it, you can make it CO2. And the environmental risks of these rock dust are lower than for mineral fertilizer because they're released gradually. So you don't have these peaks in availability where it's then flushed out. And as I have shown in modeling work with orchidea, so this greatly reduced. So my idea, which derives from the understanding I derived on the phosphorus constraint land carbon sink, is can we use that to boost the natural land carbon sink? We know that phosphorus constrains a large part of the terrestrial carbon sink. And the idea is to spray rock dust on ecosystems. And the CO2 removal can then be happened by the enhanced weathering reaction, but also by stimulating the plant growth by this organic carbon uptake pathway, which has not yet been accounted for before. Also, the application outside the agricultural area has not been before. So the idea is obviously crazy. So you do it first in a model to see if it's worth pursuing at all. And we did that with orchidea, and you can see some scenario simulations where I assume certain kind of basalt dust being spread over remote areas. And in red, you can see areas where we have really substantial amounts of CO2 being removed from the atmosphere by spraying natural existence with rock dusts. And these areas which have the largest CO2 removal potential, that's usually areas where this biotic effect, this fertilization effect, is much larger than the effect of the enhanced weathering reaction. So this work shows that the potential of CO2 removal by rock dust is larger than previously thought by having this biotic uptake pathway, and also by applying it outside the agricultural sector. So to summarize the second part, this is really work in its infancy, the science there, but it's fastly developing because of the political needs. So the resume is that rock dust can help to address these multiple policy aims. And the work I did was showing that the interactions between the rock dust and the biota is non-negligible and can even have some further potential we could take advantage of. However, the main problem is that field-scale applications, like even in agricultural areas, they're just being initiated, so we have no field-scale evidence. So there's a lot of things to do, which is my perspective. We argue in a paper, in a recent paper led by Sarah Vika, that there are many, many more interactions between rock dust and biota than fertilization effect. So there's many things, much to do there. A major issue with the application of enhanced weathering is that you have to prove that there's CO2 being removed to make money from it. And this is blocking the whole sector to boost. So you need to monitor, report, and verify the carbon removals. And we think that there's a option for the modeling tools we developed to assist in that. Then the idea is also to apply it in combination with other carbon dioxide removal measures like afforestation or biochar, because there are positive synergies between them. So you can even have more than the sum of them by applying them in combination. And another thing is the scalability of this measure. So there are some crazy ideas that you use bombers to put bombs which contain trees and biochar and enhanced weathering. And you have satellites which show exactly where to bomb to scale it. And this has to be taken into consideration because depending on the technology, the application and the production of this rock dust, which takes a lot of energy, also will emit against CO2. So this is something we're working together with Katsutanaka here Institute, for example. But overall, I just want to express here that cutting emissions is more important than removing the CO2 later. So I don't emphasize that as a solution. And with that, I want to thank you for the attention. I want to thank in particular Victor and Philip for the mentoring of all the years and being like really good role models, motivating me every day. Many ideas stem from the Imbalance P project, which was very diverse. I got a lot of broad ideas about the phosphorus cycle. Many thanks to the orchidea land surface model community for providing such a cool land surface model. In particular, also the many postdocs and PhD students which happen to develop the CMP version, and also the LSE and the Sealand for just having such a fruitful and nice working environment. So thank you, everyone.